Now you might say, okay, I've got an alternative approach given that fact. My approach is, I'm going to pick and choose from all the different perspectives and come up with my own view. So I'll take a little of Christianity, a little of Buddhism, throw Shirley MacLaine in here for good luck. Okay. Stir it up. I'm going to come up with my own view of God. Not a good idea. Let me tell you why. I call that the smorgasbord approach. You ever noticed what happens when somebody goes to a smorgasbord for dinner? And they sit down at their table. You know what's on their plate? Everything they like. You know what's off the plate? What they don't like, unless their mom's there. Okay? You know what happens when people approach the question of God by picking and choosing according to the smorgasbord approach? You know what happens? They always end up with a picture of God that looks exactly like the person who went looking for Him. If a person starts off and they have if they're liberal Democrats, God turns out to be a Ted Kennedy in the sky. If they're conservative Republicans, he's a Rush Limbaugh figure. Because if you approach the question of God by picking and choosing according to what you like and don't like, you're pretty much guaranteed you're not going to get at the truth. Why? Because you will be led by what you want to be true, and you'll create a God in your image rather than trying to find the true God. Dangerous approach. So what we ought to do is we ought to try to approach this question by sifting the evidence and trying to see if a case can be made for that a religion is true. Now, I happen to believe that of all the world's religions, Christianity, and it's not actually a religion, it is actually a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. But of all the perspectives, Christianity alone is one that is based upon evidence. It is one that is based upon proof and argument and evidence. And to become a follower of Jesus is not to have to step into the dark and believe something just because you believe it. How different this is from the other systems. Take Islam. If you ask a Muslim, why should I believe the Quran? The answer is because the Quran says it's the Word of God. Well, how do we know that's true? Well, Muhammad went into a cave and an angel revealed it to him, and he came out and told us this was the Word of God. Well, what if Muhammad was lying? Well, he can't be, because the Quran's the Word of God. So you either accept it or reject it. There's no evidence. But not so with Christianity. There's historical evidence that the things the New Testament says happened actually happened. And what I would like to do this morning is to say that of all the religious and philosophical leaders in the history of the world, Jesus of Nazareth was the only one who claimed that He was Himself God come to this earth. None of the others made that statement. In fact, all the others basically said they were just prophets or had philosophical ideas that made sense to them. But Jesus alone claimed that He was God Himself and backed that up with miracles and the resurrection, and He rose from the dead. And if those things really happened, then our quest for God is over with. We stop with Him. If they didn't happen, then Christianity is a fraud, and we've got to look somewhere else. So I happen to believe that for three reasons I will share with you this morning, the New Testament documents are historically reliable. Now, I'm going to ask you to turn to a passage in a minute, but I want to say this morning that I believe the Bible is a revelation from God, and it's the Word of God. But I'm not going to pretend that this morning, because I'm going to try to persuade you of why I'm a Christian without assuming that this book is inspired, though I do believe that. I'm going to assume that the manuscripts of the New Testament, and there are 27 different documents, letters in the New Testament, I'm simply going to assume that they're historical sources that we can think about to see if they're accurate or not. Now, does that make sense to you, ladies and gentlemen? So I don't assume here this morning that the Bible is the Word of God, though I believe that. I'm merely approaching the New Testament as though it's a set of documents, and our question is, are they reliable? Now, given that approach, if you have a Bible, would you turn to the third Gospel, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 1. I want to read the first 4 verses to you and then give you an illustration as to why I believe this is the truth. Let's begin reading in verse 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the Word have handed them down to us. It seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the exact truth of the things you have been taught. And what Luke tells us is that he did research, he interrogated eyewitnesses, and he made sure that when he wrote his account of the life of Jesus, he did his very best to make sure that he was recording real facts and accurate information in a good consecutive order so that the readers would know, not legend, but know the exact truth about what had been written. Now, Luke could be lying through his teeth. Maybe he's saying that and didn't do it. Why should we believe that he actually did this? My first reason is this. Whenever we can put the New Testament to the test archaeologically, the New Testament has been confirmed over and over and over again. You have to understand that when you write legend, when a person is reading ancient legend, legend doesn't take pains to get details accurate. Details don't matter to a legendary account. By contrast, over and over again, we have been able to verify little details of the Gospels that have nothing to do with the story, ladies and gentlemen, except for the fact that that's the way it really happened. Let me illustrate it. In John chapter 5, you don't need to turn there, but in John chapter 5, we are told that there was a little town called Bethesda, and there was a pool there where Jesus healed a man at that pool. And we are told that that pool was surrounded by 5 porticos, and a portico was just a concrete pillar. Now, for years, skeptics thought that that was a legendary account, and here's why. In no other piece of writing outside John's Gospel was there ever any mention that there was a town there called Bethesda. No one even believed the town existed. Much less had anybody ever discovered a pool there. Until archaeologists discovered the town and discovered the pool. They also discovered that the pool was surrounded not by 3 or 4, but precisely 5 porticos. I have a friend who went there a few years back and had his picture taken standing. It doesn't have water in it any longer, but you can see those pillars just as it was in Jesus' day. Now, that doesn't prove that Jesus healed a man there. I admit that. But what it does is it tells us something about the intentions of the people who wrote these documents. It tells us that their intention was to do the best they could to preserve details accurately, even if they had nothing to do with the legend, if you get my drift. Why would you take pains to make sure you recorded 5 pillars instead of 15 or not even mention them if you're just spilling out a legend that has nothing to do with being rooted in fact? Now, this kind of thing happens over and over again, so that I have become convinced that when the New Testament describes something about what first century Judaism was like or what Jerusalem was like, it is telling us the truth because archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that the New Testament documents are accurate, even to the level of irrelevant small details. May I say to you as well, as part of this first point, that there are writers outside the New Testament that tell us about Jesus of Nazareth that weren't even Christians. The early Roman and Greek and Jewish historians, with no New Testament at all, tell us that Jesus of Nazareth lived, that he gathered disciples around himself, that he was a magician of some sort and performed wonders, that he was executed by Pontius Pilate, that his followers believed they'd seen him alive shortly after his murder, and that within no more than 10 years, the religion that he started had spread all the way from Jerusalem, hundreds of miles away to the city of Rome. It is for these reasons that there's extra biblical confirmation of the New Testament documents that I am inclined to take these writings as serious history. Reason number 1. Here's a second reason why I'm a Christian. I'm going to give you a fancy $1.98 word, and then I'll explain it to you. The second reason I'm a Christian is because of Jewish oral tradition. Now you're sitting there thinking, spell it. Okay, Jewish oral tradition. What does that mean? We have now studied cultures that are called oral cultures. An oral culture is a culture that passes on its traditions through word of mouth and through memorization, not through writing and print. We have discovered that in oral cultures, people in those communities were able to memorize speeches on a first hearing and were able to pass on generation after generation the history of their community without changing a detail and getting it accurate. In particular, in first century Jewish culture, which was an oral culture that valued memorization, little children who went to school didn't take notes, they memorized the sayings of their teachers. We now know that in Jesus' day, rabbis would gather students to study under them. And among a rabbi's pupils, suppose he had 30 students studying under him, he'd pick a small group that the rest of the pupils knew were the authorities among all of his students. And it was their job to take notes in private on what he taught, but you couldn't show the notes in public. And you were supposed to commit your rabbi's sayings and deeds to memory so that when he died, the community looked to the small group of people to pass on the teachings of that rabbi and his deeds to later generations faithfully without changing the details but preserving accurate information about that rabbi. Sound familiar? That is exactly what Jesus of Nazareth did with his disciples. He was clearly recognized as an authoritative religious teacher. And in keeping with his community and his culture, he had as many as 70 and more people following him, but he selected a small group of people within that group we call disciples, and it was their responsibility in keeping with the traditional pattern of a rabbi-pupil relationship, though Jesus was much more than a rabbi, he certainly was a religious teacher. It was their job to commit what he said and did to memory, so that when he died, they were to pass it on to others without changing it. They were to be very careful not to allow legend and inaccuracy to creep into their account.